There is a place that is spoken about only in whispers, a dark area that spawns the beginnings of urban legends, a place where anything can happen and usually does. During the light of day, it hides just outside of view, but when the sun goes down, spirits, creatures of the night, roam free, and things do go bump in the night. It is in every state and every country, and there is no escaping it, no matter how safe you feel behind your locked doors and latched windows. So we invite you to turn down the lights and turn up your radio while we join Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis, your hosts, on a journey into the darkness on the edge of town.
Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Today, joining us on the show, Richard Spence is a full professor of history. He specializes in Russian intelligence and military history, and his course offerings include modern espionage, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, history of secret societies, and the occult in history, right up our alley. He's written a book entitled Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. That's what he's here to chat with us about this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Spence. We appreciate it.
It's great to be on, Dave.
Fascinating topics. I've got to know, what drew your attention, as a historian, to these aspects of our history and the occult angles?
You know, I get asked that all the time, and you'd think that I'd have a nice, pithy answer. But I really, I think it has to do with one thing sort of leading to another. I guess another way, if it goes all the way back, if it was kind of weird or unusual, I found it was interesting. See, the things that I study are the things that I find interesting. And so I guess it says something about me, what I find interesting. What I meant by one thing going from another is that we might get more into this, but the way I came across Crowley, what really led me to write a book about him and his connections to British intelligence, really came out of a completely different project I was working on. And so Crowley was just this kind of afterthought. I was actually writing a book about another spy, a person who probably isn't nearly as well known as Aleister Crowley, a guy named Sidney Riley. And Sidney Riley was active in New York during World War I. And Sidney Riley had connections to agents of British intelligence in New York. So I knew the stories that Crowley had told and other people had told about him, that he had variously claimed to in some way have been working for His Majesty's government, doing patriotic service in New York during the same period. Well, New York's a big city, and just because Riley and Crowley are there, so are 8 million other people. So it didn't necessarily mean that they had to meet each other, but still they were moving in certain circles. So I thought, maybe I should check. Maybe Crowley and Riley had some kind of connection. So almost as a kind of afterthought, I wrote off to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., because I knew that one of the things they had there were one of the few repositories of intelligence-related information that is declassified and generally available. And what I'm talking about is something that really doesn't exist anymore, but which was kind of a big deal, much bigger deal than, say, the FBI and the CIA, which didn't even exist then, in 1917. And that was actually a branch of the U.S. Army called the Military Intelligence Division, the MID for short. And once the United States was in the war, the MID actually took over a fair share of what we would now think of as kind of national security activities. They handled a lot of the work that then later sort of fell onto the FBI. But what they did was that because they were investigating everybody, they compiled this gigantic index of suspects and of case files, and all of that is neatly on microfilm. And so what you can do is you could write it, and you could say, are there any files, are there any cards that pertain to this guy, Aleister Crowley? There was. So I sent off for it, and, the file is, I got the file in my hand right now. It's not very big. It's maybe, 20, 25 pages. Most of it didn't have anything to do with Crowley, but then there was one page page 4, in a report from the military intelligence officer in West Point, New York. So a little backstory on that. It turns out that Crowley had been sort of camping out on an island in the Hudson River not far from West Point that summer, and that had attracted the attention of this officer and some others. And so they'd begun investigating him. They knew that one of his girlfriends, a woman who had been meeting him there, was a woman named Madeline George. And just to pick up the report itself, Madeline George, an actress of New York City who had formerly been investigated by the Department of Justice on charges of being a German spy, had been together with Crowley on Esopus Island in the Hudson River. So they decided they would look into him. And here's what got me started on this. It was determined, again quoting from the report, that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It was found that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with this German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. So, what was the significance of that? Why was that a smoking gun? Because it basically confirmed what Crowley had claimed, but which many people, even those who otherwise supported him, never really believed. That while appearing to be a anti-British propagandist, that's what this reference to, because what Crowley was doing in New York for much of this period, while the war was going on back home, he was in New York, and he was writing, in fact became part of the editorial board of a publication called The Fatherland. And if that sounds, possibly Germanic, it was. The Fatherland was a blatantly pro-German propaganda sheet published by a fellow by the name of George Sylvester Viereck, who was closely connected to German agents in America, and it was presenting the Kaiser's propaganda. And Crowley was enlisted and wrote for this, and did indeed write things that were just, hands down scurrilous anti-British propaganda. So that raised the question that Crowley could, in later years, in trying to account for this, would always give these kinds of sort of vague explanations that, well, yeah, I was writing propaganda for the Germans and I was saying some really nasty things about the king and saying things like how cool it was that Zeppelins were bombing London. But I all did that actually for the good of England. I did that with official permission. And that just seemed, was generally taken as Crowley trying to make excuses for, bad behavior or simply engaging in, just outright fantasy. But it turns out it was true. Now, of course, saying that he is an employee of the British government and that he was writing propaganda with the full knowledge of British officials in New York still leaves a lot of explanation of exactly what he was doing and who he was doing it with. But what this did is that, I was working again on a book dealing with Riley, so I really wasn't, so I sort of set this aside, and after that book was done, I went back and I was kind of looking for something, to write an article about. Because we academics are, the way we justify our existence is writing books and articles for journals, for which, in the articles and journals, I might add to anybody who's interested, we don't get paid a penny. But nevertheless, we do that. Okay. We just do that, because, it again, justifies our existence to the university administration. So I thought, that'd be kind of an interesting article. And so I wrote up an article which, has the same title as the book, or rather I should say the book has the same title as the article, because I just thought that Secret Agent 666 was too good of a title not to reuse. Right. I couldn't come up with a better one. So I wrote a short article, that was, published in a thing called the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which was, a pretty small academic journal that catered to a fairly limited audience. Generally, when you write things for academic journals, it's a lot like taking it in the backyard, digging a hole and burying it, because not many people will see it. But that article just kind of took on a life of its own. And I have the internet to thank for basically being a means by which people would copy the article and cut and paste it and just spread it around to bulletin boards and various lists, But again, it wasn't, since I didn't get paid for the article, it didn't make any difference. But it was disseminated. to a much wider audience of people, because Crowley attracts a lot of attention for a variety of reasons. And I began to get feedback from that. I began to get feedback mostly saying, this is really interesting. Is there more of a story here? I mean, you sort of determined here that Crowley was somehow really working for the British government and was connected to their clandestine affairs, but is there more? What more can you come up with? And at first, to be honest, I was reluctant, because I had another project I wanted to get to, and it didn't have anything to do with Aleister Crowley. I might add that I have never gotten back to that project, because I was eventually convinced that, well, okay, if nothing else, maybe I can come up with a larger article, or maybe I can find something else.
Right.
So I began one of those searches, and they tend to be a fairly long search in a lot of places, collecting information, looking for new pieces of information, looking for pieces of a puzzle that fit together. And then one of the ways I've sort of described what I do, and I don't think I'm really that unique, but I think a lot of other historians do, is that very often the research we're assembling is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. I think most people out there can identify with that. But the difference between this kind of jigsaw puzzle and an ordinary one is that in an ordinary jigsaw puzzle, well, you know what the picture is. You know what it's about. If it's a face of Elvis, or if it's a Paris street scene, or if it's a landscape, because it's right there in the front of the box. So you know what you're trying to create. And the other thing, of course, that ordinary jigsaw puzzles have is they have those always convenient edge pieces,
right,
that you find and put together that frame everything. Now, the difference in the sort of research jigsaw puzzle is that, one, you really don't know the extent of the picture you're trying to put together, because there are no edge pieces. This thing can just potentially grow and grow and grow. There's not necessarily any limitation. There may be a point of diminishing returns, but you're assembling a picture that you might think it's one thing, but it may turn out to be something else, and more things can be added, and you really don't know how large it's going to be. But that's it. It's putting together these pieces of information, looking for things that fit. So the research began. There were a variety, in the book itself, I have acknowledgments from people who, helped me with information, steered me away from some wrong information. But pretty much it was just this lot of stuff which is not very exciting to anyone outside of it. It means going through lots of pieces of paper and it's assembling things. But it begins to come together. And, the real, if there's I hesitate to use the word thrilling when it comes to historical research, but every now and then, well, like finding this statement that I just read from that MID file, that's the thing you've been looking for. You've gone through hundreds of other pages, and then there it is. There's the one thing that ties them together. There is the kind of centerpiece, or there's something that leads you in a new direction. So that's the kind of the satisfaction we get from these things. So the book took shape, and I guess this would be as good a time as any to make a disclaimer or two. And one of the things that I want to make clear, which I make clear in the introduction to the book, but do it here as well, is that I am not to be counted among the ranks of Crowley followers. All right, so I do not have any particular type of religious devotion to him. I am not a Thelemite, for the people out there who know what that means. On the other hand, I don't have any particular axe to grind against him. So I guess one of the things you could say is when it comes to Aleister Crowley, I'm basically an agnostic. And that was the way I approached it. I didn't approach it of trying to prove or disprove anything, but to see what sort of story emerged, to see what I could find. And
well, if I could stop you there real quickly.
Sure.
What I'd like from you, Richard, for our audience, we have a lot of younger audience members that are coming on board, and even some of the older members who've been listening for years and are interested, aren't exactly familiar with who Aleister Crowley is. We hear Ozzy Osbourne songs about him. We know he appears in the background of Sgt. Pepper's album cover. We know some of the pop culture reference. And I think a lot of people end up lumping him in or confusing him with Anton LaVey or, other people of that sort. Can you give us a little bit of a background and understand on who the Great Beast was and why that nickname was attached to him?
Okay, well, his mother gave him that name, which is the interesting story. Yeah, he and Anton LaVey both have bald heads, but that's about as far as the connection goes. Aleister Crowley is probably most widely noted today. The most common thing you will see is that he is the arch occultist of the 20th century, or he is the arch Satanist of the 20th century. Aleister Crowley and Satanist are frequently linked together, or the most evil man of the 20th century. Opinion on him seems to be pretty much split between two camps. You do have people who, I won't say worship him, but they regard him as a religious teacher. They regard him almost as a Christ-like or messianic figure, which is, what he wanted to be, but never did that on a mass scale. And that still survives in the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, an organization, and the Thelemite movement, which is branches around the world. But a much larger body, more of popular opinion, regards him as a kind of symbol of evil, of sort of satanic occultism, a boogeyman. And again, because of claiming to take a kind of agnostic stance, I'm not really interested in either one of those. And the way that I tried to approach him was simply looking at him not as a messiah and not as a devil, but as a man, a very peculiar man in certain ways, a man who was, could be extraordinarily difficult, a man who probably did some, rather bad things, but also a man who was just, the way he eventually came across to me was a kind of mass of contradictions, which in a lot of ways most people are, really. It's very difficult to pin down who they are. So Crowley went through this. The reason he shows up on the album cover of Sgt. Pepper's, along with a lot of other people, is that there was a kind of resurgence of interest in him. He died in 1947. He was born in 1875, died in 1947, right after the Second World War. He did not achieve in his lifetime anywhere near the notoriety that he has today. And that, again, was partly because of the 1960s, the emergence of the counterculture, which Crowley probably, were he alive at the time, I feel safe in saying would have probably detested. But nevertheless, along with other things, the counterculture sort of embraced him because he appeared to be a countercultural figure, a rebel, certainly a avant-garde in all matters sexual and religious. You can also, one of the things you can give him credit for is pioneering recreational drug taking. In that sense, Crowley was very much ahead of his time in his heyday in the early 20th century. But much of what survives today, what people tend to think of Aleister Crowley today, is an image and a myth that goes with that. Not really the person themselves. And that's one of the things you have, in history you encounter this a lot. Some people, not many, Crowley's one of them, who attain a kind of mythical status. They do indeed enjoy this kind of life after death, this kind of ongoing and kind of changing existence, long after they sort of departed the physical realm. And it's one of those things that as the myths grow, they often tend to distort who the person actually was. So, the image that, if people look around for Aleister Crowley, the one that you're going to get is, his bullet-headed image, generally of him glowering straight ahead with a bow tie at the camera, or other ones with him dressed in various attire, often looking peculiarly sinister, or people reading that into it. Now, the other things that sort of get lost as the legend grows, I mean, things that I thought were interesting about Crowley that I hadn't realized was that he was a man who was born into a prosperous English family, not super rich, but well-to-do. His family made their money, by the way, from brewing. Crowley ales, I think, which were recently still around, were part of a whole family enterprise. His family was part of it wasn't just his nuclear family, but the entire Crowley clan who ran this. But the other thing, more interesting than that, was that his immediate family, his mother and father, were members of what we would describe today as a strict fundamentalist Christian sect, the Plymouth Brethren. This was basically a sect that, you kind of know the story, pretty much believed that everybody else on earth was going to hell except them. Very much a preparation for the after. His father was so taken for this that his father basically quit the business and became a lay preacher. That's how dedicated his father was to it. And Aleister, whose real name, by the way, is Edward Alexander Crowley. See, that's another little detail. Aleister Crowley isn't even his real name. Aleister is a name he adopted. His name, his legal name until his death, the name that's on his passports, the name that's on his bank accounts, is Edward Alexander Crowley. Aleister was his sort of attempt to fancy up Alexander in some respects. But little Eddie, as he was called, I think his father died when he was around 11, and he was devoted to his father. And his father's death seems to have been one of these things that had a very profound and lasting effect on him. And one of the reasons for it is that with his father's death, he was left in the care of his mother, who he did not have that good of a relationship with, and his uncle, his mother's brother, who overall I get the impression didn't like the kid very much. So he was then shunted off to the horrors of British public schools, which seemed to have further marked him in that way. So he grew up in a certain degree of privilege. His family was well enough that well into Crowley, in fact, inherited enough money that had he had any money sense at all, had he had any entrepreneurial abilities, he could have lived comfortably for the rest of his life. He became an undischarged bankrupt in 1934 and remained that until his dying day, just because he ran through all of the money that he had. He was not a good businessman. He was not a good manager of money. He was not someone you would want to loan money to because you almost certainly would never get it paid back. So he was terrible in that respect. And that's one of the things I think that cost him a lot of friendships, among other things. But he also, in his early years, in the early 20th century, he was a world-class mountain climber. He climbed peaks in the Himalayas. I think he was one of the first to attempt K2. He could have had an entire career in that if he had wanted to. Well, the general image you get of him is this kind of bald, sort of fat Buddha-like character, and he, did gain weight in his later years. Younger years, he was a very large, about 6 foot tall, physically robust, athletic. This is early on, he was a mountain climber, and he basically has the physique that goes with that. He also was a very good chess player. Some people think he was a world-class chess player. Some other people argue that no, he was just a pretty good chess player. But there again was something that he might have pursued. I'm also convinced that he could have had a great career as an actor, because his ability to assume different characters and guises, all of that fit in with it. He probably could have been a stage magician, a performer in any number of ways. But instead, what he really did is that in his own way, he followed in his beloved father's footsteps. Because remember, I noted that his father had put aside worldly work in order to preach the gospel, as he saw it. And that's what his son did, except that his son preached a gospel which was almost completely at odds with everything that his father did. But it's kind of interesting that in that way, whereas you think of him being completely separate from his family, if you think of it that way, it's not. He also sought to be a kind of preacher, a dispenser of his own gospel, but one which he believed would actually supplant Christianity. That was his idea, that he was going to usher in this whole new age of spiritual enlightenment that would be the replacement for Christianity that had come in some 2,000 years before. Clearly that didn't quite work, although, things have perhaps been moving more in Crowley's way than we think. Today he probably claims far more followers than he would otherwise. So he is a contradictory figure, and the question that would immediately come up, I think, in a lot of people's minds is that, well, what I'm basically looking into is his role and his connections to British intelligence during the First World War. That's probably the centerpiece of the book, but all the way up and through World War II. And as I began to research this, as I began to look at the people he knew, the people who sort of passed through his lives, the people whose lives he passed through, it became abundantly clear that a great many of them, if not most of them, also had some sort of connection to intelligence. Because remember the thing that I mentioned earlier about him spending the First World War not fighting for king and country, not even staying in England to help the war effort, but going off to America, apparently on some sort of lark of his own, some sort of spiritual quest, and there falling in league with German agents and publishing anti-British propaganda. Now, the question you might wonder is that when he came back to England, which he did in December of 1919, after the war was over, he landed in Plymouth, England, sailed from New York. You might expect there would be some questions, right? I mean, what he did wartime was, well, if not treason, it certainly came very close to it. Well, nothing happened, all right? He was not questioned. He simply came. By the way, get this. The passport that he came to New York with in 1914, by the way, the day he landed in New York in 1914 was October 31st. And the ship that he came to New York on was the Lusitania, which was, still had a few months to live, but nevertheless, and I think, his arrival on Halloween was, well, that was just the shipping schedule, but it's still, there you go. But the passport that he arrived with, the British passport he carried, was no longer valid by the time he returned because changes had been made to the passports during the war. So he had to go to the British consulate, remember the same place that gave him the okay to the Americans, and he had to get a new passport. Now, if any of His Majesty's officials didn't want this guy back in England, if they had some axe to grind against him, they could have denied him a passport. And considering the activities, they were within their rights to do it. They don't. They grant him one. He's on his way. He goes back to England. He gets off without a hitch. He goes and has Christmas dinner with his aunt. And everything is fine until the British press, the tabloid press, figures out that he's back in England, and they raise a stink about what it was he had done. And he quickly leaves the country and goes to France. And in fact, won't return to England for more than a decade. And that itself is a reason that... So he wasn't unwelcome in England by the British government. He was made unwelcome there by the attention of the press, who had caught on to his activities in America and made an issue about it. But officials of the British government neither came forward to say anything for him or against him. They simply saw to it that he got out of the country, and it became a kind of non-issue. It was another one of these things that became apparent that there was always a kind of helping hand that would appear. So you might remember that I mentioned that in the early 1930s, he went bankrupt. No longer any visible means of support. Well, he's going to live for another 12 years. But in that 12 years, he is never without a roof over his head, a rather comfortable one. He's never without clothing or food. And furthermore, he's never without his weekly allotment of heroin because he had become a hopeless junkie by that time. So how does he live? Who pays the bills? His legions of loyal followers? Not really. There were a few wealthy friends who assisted him, but he never, this is what it boils down to. For all of the questionable things he did, for all even of the apparently treasonous things he did, He is never called to account for them, and he is never criticized by anybody in British officialdom. Now, the secret to that, to understanding what's going on there, is sort of understanding something about the intelligence world itself, or at least the intelligence world of that period, and especially in Britain. And the basic deal that still, I think, exists in intelligence is that there is almost always a formal or a tacit agreement between an agent or an asset who works for a service and the service itself. And that agreement is this: the service will never talk about what you did. It won't make an issue out of that. What you did for them remains secret, and you will never talk about it either. Everyone will simply pretend that it never happened, and there will be no public discussion of it. And that was because at that time you were talking about, the whole idea that Great Britain or other countries had intelligence agencies was seen as unspeakable. Those things didn't even exist, but they did.
So there was all of these type of secrets running around, and yeah, to even hear Aleister Crowley's name attached to this, that had to have been a massive surprise for everybody. Here's a guy that you might have thought was kind of a braggart or trying to infuse himself in different pieces of history because of the ego. But when you start peeling back the layers and piecing this puzzle together, it starts to fit, which is very strange. I do have to mention real quickly, our guest this evening is Richard Spence. We're talking about Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, and his work in an undercover method. Were you really surprised when you started to peel back the layers of this onion to realize just how ingrained he was in this system?
Yeah, and it was one of those things that kept surprising me, which I guess is why it eventually turns into a book. I was looking at his activities in America during the First World War, and I might add one of those little details that's often, again, forgotten, is that the United States, for most of World War I, is a neutral country. So the war starts in 1914. The United States doesn't enter the war until the middle of 1917. So we only sort of come in during the end. So for Crowley is mostly active there as a British intelligence asset working in a neutral country, attempting to influence its policies. And the policy which the British government and which British intelligence of the U.S. was most interested in, what their primary mission was to bring the United States into the war on Britain's side. That's what the goal was. Everything else was to work towards that. And in one of Crowley's diaries, one of the things that he kept that are both helpful and frustrating is that he kept diaries, magical diaries. But he was one of those people who kept an almost kind of daily account of what it was he was doing and what it was he ate and who he saw. And the reason why those can be very important and why they were very useful to me is that they fix him in certain points. On this day he was in New Orleans, and this day he was in New York, and this day he was in San Francisco. You can sort of trace his movements by these. And in many cases, the people he came in contact with. They can be very frustrating because they're often couched in deliberate or sort of fake mystical language. He will refer to people, by sort of code names. That's basically what they are. They're these names that may be compiled from the Greek alphabet, but essentially he's talking about people in code, and that becomes very difficult. Very often that he's meeting with someone. And for instance, I know that in 1915, he goes to Los Angeles, essentially to Hollywood as it was then, and he goes there to meet with someone, but he never gives you what their name is. And I'd really be terribly interested to know who that person was, but he doesn't give you any other clues. There's no way to decipher it. But Crowley is, I think he's noting in one of these diaries, and it's in early 1917, in January, I think. January, February. And it's right after, someone can look this up, the United States makes a step towards going to war by severing diplomatic relations with Germany. So the Germans had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Wilson administration had severed diplomatic relations. And Crowley had read about this in the paper, of course, and he makes a little note, sort of congratulating. Remember, he's writing this basically for himself, that he's now gratified that his work has borne fruit, that he's giving himself credit for this in some way. And, again, you could say that, well, I don't know, maybe that's just the mental aberration of a megalomaniac who tends to think that everything is connected with him. Although you don't see that elsewhere, and again, it's not really sort of public boasting, it's something that he's saying to himself. And to whatever degree he may actually have played a role, he thought he did. And the reason he could make that claim is that he was working again with an entire British intelligence apparatus. Crowley was only a relatively small part of a much larger British intelligence operation in the United States that was, at bottom, dedicated to bringing the U.S. into the war. And other British intelligence agents, the man who ran the biggest British intelligence branch in New York, a fellow by the name of Sir William Wiseman, said something very much the same at the time, that he believed that their work was really moving in the right direction. So the question that might come up, how did Crowley's writing anti-British propaganda for a pro-German magazine in any way assist the British cause? I mean, what was the point of that? And that's one of those things that it took me a while to figure out. Why would he do that?
Well, let's do this. We have to take a break.
Okay.
We'll take a quick break. We'll come back and find the answers to that and so much more. You're listening to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.
Beyond the Darkness.
Welcome back. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Hey, remember, you've got just a couple days left. If you want to subscribe to True Crime Tuesday, you can get a chance to have your name entered into the drawing to win a 1-year subscription. So if you sign up, it's only $5 a month as it is, and that gives you 4 brand new episodes every month, 60 to 90 minutes long of interview, plus another 30 to 60 minutes of dumb crimes, stupid criminals every week delivered right to you. So if you'd like to sign up for it, you've been on the fence post wondering if you should, take the plunge. Try it now. You're going to love the shows we've been doing lately, and it'll give you a chance to hear all of the past archives over the last 5 months here of the show. You'll never miss another minute in the best of True Crime Talk Radio. And again, that's only $5 a month. You can quit anytime you like, or you can maintain it and continue on so that you never miss another minute of the show. But by signing up by September 1st, make sure you finish and sign up before September 1st. That will put you into the drawing so that you may win. We're going to draw 3 names on September 1st. We'll announce them next week on the show to let you know who the winners are. 3 lucky members will get a 1-year subscription to True Crime Tuesday. Go check it out right now. Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. That's Secret Agent 666 we're talking about. Richard Spence, our guest tonight. All right, Richard. So you kind of led us up here into the break again of how did all of this information come together into what you were able to find. Please walk us through this.
Well, the question I think that we come up with is, one of the things we note is that Crowley's most obvious activity in wartime New York in the First World War was writing not British propaganda. I mean, you might figure if this guy is going to serve the interests of Great Britain, why wouldn't he come to New York and write anti-German articles? Why would he go to work for a German publication and write anti-British articles? And why would British officials encourage him to do so? Why would they want him to do that? Well, that's where, again, it's one of these things that in the sort of world of intelligence, very little is exactly what it seems. And I think that we've heard a lot lately about things like fake news. Right. About propaganda and black propaganda and white propaganda. And what Crowley's job was to infiltrate the German propaganda and intelligence apparatus operating in the neutral United States. His job was to find out what they were thinking and how they remember the battle here, this kind of secret war which is going on, a war within a war, was the war to influence American public opinion. To influence American public opinion away from Germany and towards Britain and, France, but mostly towards Britain. And that could be achieved. The thing is that someone who was quite obviously a British propagandist was just that. They were obviously a British propagandist. And it was very easy to peg them as such. It would be much less likely to be looking for someone who was a British intelligence asset who was ensconced among German propagandists. So there again is one of these things. It's a kind of backstory as to Crowley. Now, Crowley shows up in New York again in Halloween 1914, and literally within weeks, he has infiltrated. He has managed to befriend people or win the confidence of German agents in New York, who then employed him in writing for the Fatherland. Now, that was one of the things. The question was, well, why would the Germans trust this guy? Obviously he's an Englishman that just got off the boat. He's also an Englishman with, again, he wasn't that well known at the time, but any kind of basic background check would show that he was, apparently an occultist and apparently a sexual libertine, among other things. A very questionable character, not necessarily someone you'd want associated with your organization. So why would they take him in? Well, there are a number of answers to that. The guy that was the editor of the Fatherland, I mentioned him previously, George Sylvester Viereck. Well, guess what? George Sylvester Viereck was a German patriot and a publisher, but he was also an occultist. That is, he had many of the same esoteric interests that Crowley did. So that was one of the reasons why he would take an interest in him. It doesn't quite, though, explain why he would trust him. And I understand that you have to go back about 4 years to London before the war, around 1910. And in that year, thereabouts, Aleister Crowley was initiated into an occult organization, the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO. Again, an organization that still exists today, quite different from what it was then. But at that time, the OTO was a German secret society. It had been formed there early in the 20th century. Most of its members were Germans, and it was just beginning to branch out. And Crowley, in fact, was initiated as a member and then almost immediately anointed the kind of head of the organization for the English-speaking world, or at least for Britain and America, which may only show how small it was at that point. But the man, here's the little puzzle piece, the man that initiated him into this German secret society was a German journalist living in Britain, at least that was his day job, a fellow by the name of Theodor Reuss, R-E-U-S-S. Now, Reuss, again, was a German occultist. That's what he and Crowley had in common. And that's why he selected Crowley to be inducted into this organization. But that's not all Reuss was. Reuss also was an agent of the Kaiser's intelligence service. And one of the things that he was running in England under the guise of his journalistic activity was a whole string of agents. And it's also, esoteric, the things like occult organizations can serve a number of purposes. One, keep in mind that they tend to operate in secrecy, right? They tend not to operate publicly. They're also very selective in who they bring in. So that means that they can be very useful for genuinely pursuing esoteric topics, and they can, but they also make an excellent cover for recruitment for espionage. That is, you're recruiting people into an organization that appears to have nothing to do with that, but which is very selective, very secretive, and whose activities are largely hidden. See, that's one of the things that actually, if anything comes out of the book, it's that Crowley's connection with British intelligence isn't a one-off. It's not a fluke. It's the norm. There is a kind of natural affinity between intelligence and the occult. The two things rub up against each other very well. because both very often are involved in acquiring and keeping, acquiring secret information and keeping that information secret. So, the reason why the Germans in New York would have accepted Crowley, the reason why Viereck, fellow occultists, would still bring this guy in and make him part of the German propaganda cabinet in New York, was because, Viereck certainly checked with Berlin. He was going to vet Crowley in some way. He knew how to do that, and he would check. And you remember the fellow Theodore Royce, the spy occultist who had initiated Crowley into it? Well, he barely got out of England when the war started without being interned, got back to Germany. Guess who he was working for during the war? German intelligence. So now he simply emerged for what he was. So it's Royce that vouches for Crowley. And this is what it is. This is what Viereck would have sent back to Berlin, and it is Royce, who was a trusted agent, who would say that, yes, you can trust this guy because he is an initiated brother in my organization. And it may very well have been. In fact, it's one of those things you can't prove, but I strongly suspect that when Royce recruited Crowley in 1910 for the OTO, he was also thinking about recruiting him as a spy. So as far as Royce might have concerned, Crowley had been working for the Germans since 1910. Now that's the only scenario, because these people aren't idiots. I mean, they do some idiotic things, but they're not idiots, as to why they would have then have accepted this Englishman into their midst and why they trusted him. It's Crowley's occult connections are the things that make all of this work. Those were his credentials. Now, once he was there, and he's, the articles he's writing for the Fatherland, one of the things he later noted when he was asked about them, and it's true, he goes, well, I wrote articles, but only a German would believe them. And true, if you look at his articles, they're really over the top. I mean, in terms of propaganda, they are incredibly unsubtle, and Crowley was talented enough to do much better than that. It's almost this kind of bwahaha, hand-wringing type of thing. It's a parody of German propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things, if you look at it, once you realize that, it's just blatantly obvious that what he's writing here are these sort of parodies of German propaganda, which of course his British controllers knew that and were encouraging to do it. But that was basically to maintain his credibility among the Germans in New York, and to be admitted to their planning meetings, and to hear about what their propaganda ploys were, and even to hear about other things. And one of the questions that was discussed there was, whether or not an attempt should be made on the British liner Lusitania. I remember, that's the same ship that Crowley had come in on.
Right.
And one of the things that he was aware of, the Lusitania has a kind of, the whole case here is, that's a whole story in and of itself, but the Lusitania was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. It was coming from New York back to Liverpool, and it was torpedoed by the U-20 off the Irish coast in May 1915 and sank with hundreds of lives lost. It did not, as many people, as you sometimes hear, and many people believe, bring the United States into the war. That didn't happen for another 2 years. But it did permanently damage the image of Germany in the eyes of the American public. Because in the American press, and thanks to other British propagandists in the American press, and there were plenty of them, this was spun as an act of Hun barbarism. Now, the Germans could retaliate that actually legally they had a perfect reason to sink the Lusitania, because although it was a liner, it was carrying war supplies. It was carrying munitions and the makings of munitions, and if it did that, it was a legitimate military target. In fact, there was a board of inquiry in the U.S. that looked into it and kind of reluctantly came to that conclusion, is that, well, it was really a mean thing to do, and it was really a thing that left, a big black mark on the German reputation, but from a technical legal point of view, they could do it. Now, that had been debated. The Lusitania also was one of the biggest British liners, and therefore it was a kind of star of the entire British merchant fleet. So Crowley knew that the Germans both in New York and they in contact with those in Berlin had kind of the idea as to whether or not, the idea maybe it should be blown up in port. Maybe we should plant saboteurs aboard. I mean, is this a kind of target? And it all sort of went back and forth in terms of, well, what kind of an effect would this have on the Americans? It's not going, it's not really going to have much. We're already at war with the British. We don't want to be at war with the Americans. So would this have a positive effect or a negative effect? Crowley, at least according to his recollection, advanced an interesting argument. His argument was that, well, you should go ahead and do it. Sinking the Lusitania would have a positive effect for Germany because it would frighten the childlike Americans. So his argument here was that the Americans have no real experience with modern warfare. They're essentially very childlike in that. And so what you want to do is you want to scare them. You want to put the fear of God into them, the fear of the Kaiser into them.
Right.
And so this would be a show of strength. See, if you do this, you'll show that Germany's tough and it's not going to take anything. And, and if the British think they're going to put a fast one on them by putting munitions aboard a passenger ship, well, we'll just sink the passenger ship. And that sort of and the Americans would be so flabbergasted by that, they would be less reluctant to ever enter a war against terrible Germany. Now, if you wanted to make an argument goading people into doing something that you knew would be a bad idea and got them to do it, that's you can't say that Aleister Crowley is responsible for the sinking of the Lusitania. There are a lot of people involved in that. It's a much bigger story. But He played his part. And when it was his opportunity to give advice to German officials in New York, who would then give advice to German officials in Berlin, he advised them to do it. And they trusted him because he had been admitted to their ranks on his presumed sterling occult connections through Royce. He therefore was a kind of infiltrator in the German camp. And that's the job he was doing for the British government, and that's why the British later on didn't want the Americans to bother him in any way. They wanted him to keep on keeping on with what he'd been up to. But it's also the thing that he could never talk about it. I mean, this was never the type of thing. I mean, think about it. Crowley, beyond, signing a secrecy agreement, remember this is the agreement between he and his British intelligence controllers. We never talk about you. You never talk about us. And that's one of the things I remind people. You hear somebody who starts regaling you with all their stories of a spy and talks about that openly and boasts about it. Either they are violating their secrecy agreement in a gross form or they're making it up. And I would suspect it's probably the latter, because anybody within that as a professional knows that you keep your mouth shut unless you're given permission to talk.
Right.
And Crowley wasn't given permission to talk. And he did a pretty good job of keeping his mouth shut. But imagine if he'd gone public with that. Not just gone public that, Aleister Crowley, who appears to be this horrible, person, this sexual degenerate and devil worshiper had any connection with His Majesty's government. They're never going to admit that openly. But also that he takes credit for actually encouraging the Germans to sink the Lusitania with the loss of hundreds of lives. Now, that's one of those things you might have to do. It's nothing that anybody ever wants discussed publicly.
Right.
So Crowley kept his mouth shut. There's another sort of tip. At one point, it's also worth noting that during the course of the 1920s, he's expelled from Italy for espionage. And at the end of the 1920s, he's expelled from France for, guess what, suspicion of espionage. And he eventually is sort of trying to justify, to show that he actually was doing service for the Allies. He mentions the name of a British naval official. And he mentions the name of Admiral then, formerly a captain, Guy Gaunt. Now, this isn't a name you'd come across anywhere, so it's very interesting he brings up that name. And he basically, I think in a moment of desperation, said, look, the one person who could really vouch for my claims of working for the British government is Guy Gaunt. So if you're going to drag me into court over something, I'm going to bring him in as a witness. Now, Guy Gaunt, as it turns out, was the British naval attaché in New York at the same time Crowley was there. And he knew Crowley. And the actual agency that Crowley is working for is British Naval Intelligence. And this is not one of the things that gets kind of confusing, because you talk about British intelligence or American intelligence or Russian intelligence or whatever. And the thing to remember is that in every one of those cases, intelligence is a house of many rooms. It's a house of many agencies. So in the U.S., for example, we've got the CIA, but then you've got the NSA, and you've got the NRO, and you've got the DIA. And all right, so intelligence isn't something that only the CIA handles. It handles a certain area of it, and then other agencies. And you know, you might think that do all those agencies cooperate with each other and know who each other's agents are? Of course they don't. Okay? The other rule in intelligence is compartmentalization. You don't know unless you need to know. And therefore, agencies don't routinely share lists of assets with each other, because that would be a huge mistake.
Right.
So all of that is kept secret. So there were almost certainly other British intelligence agents in New York who thought that Crowley was actually working for the Germans. And the thing is, that worked perfectly because they were supposed to think that. I mean, the fact that you've got other British intelligence agents who are investigating him and bad-mouthing him simply increases his credibility with the Germans. So as far as I can tell, MI5, sort of the British equivalent of the FBI, was concerned, they actively suspected Crowley of collaborating with the Germans. Naval intelligence were the ones who put him up to the whole mission. Another branch of British intelligence in New York, what we now call MI6, you know, James Bond's employers, but which was then called MI1C, which was kind of the junior component at that point. They knew about him, but he really wasn't working for them, so they didn't really deal with him too much. That is, they were perfectly willing in most cases to have the Americans and everyone else think that he was an anti-British traitor, but they're the ones who basically intervened in that report that I read the excerpt from to make sure that he wasn't bothered. So there was some cooperation between the two. So when Crowley in the late 1920s, in this kind of desperate act to try to, you know, say that, look, there's a guy that can vouch for it, he named the one guy who actually could vouch for him. The mere fact that he knew who Guy Gaunt was, and that he knew that Gaunt, as naval attaché, was head of British naval intelligence, is another indication of how involved Crowley was in this process. But it was, you know, I've got to imagine, though, that that's a tremendously frustrating thing, because for the rest of his life, Crowley had to live with the British press or someone bringing up the fact about his treasonous activities. So you got to imagine yourself in this situation of where you essentially went undercover in the enemy camp. You know, you went undercover and you pretended you were one of them, and you acted and you spoke like you were one of them, and you did so convincingly that most of your fellow countrymen were convinced of it, all for a greater cause, but a cause that you can never discuss, for which you can never receive credit. And then, as a result of those activities, not only will your real service to the country never be known, but you will have to endure for the rest of your life the accusation that you are a traitor, and you can never actually refute that. And that's one of those things that I think really stuck in Crowley's craw. Because he was, and here it goes back to this questions about the contradictions in the guy. He, at some point early on in the war, I think, or some point during the war, he was basically asked by someone, I can't remember who, a fellow Briton, so why someone like him? You know, why someone who seemed to show nothing but contempt for common morals, who seemed to, you know, be at war with God and everything that, you know, an Englishman, you know, took for granted. You know, why such a sort of flamboyant anti-establishment character like him would ever be willing to serve the king? And he gave a kind of interesting answer. And he goes, and I'm going to paraphrase it, I think it's better when he does it, but he basically said, I don't believe for a minute that the British kettle is any less black than the German pot. In other words, I don't believe that Britain is morally superior. That for me, this war isn't about that, okay? You know, the British Empire just does as much rotten stuff as the German Empire does, and any crime we accuse them of, we've committed as well. That's not it. Because that's not why I'm doing it. He goes, my loyalty is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. Oliver Twist reference there.
Mm-hmm.
And like a dog, I serve my master not because I think my master is morally superior, but because, my master may starve me and beat me, but I love him. And to me, in a way, this sounds sort of twisted to some people, but that was a certain basic statement of a kind of patriotism that in a way expected nothing in return. He wasn't arguing. The argument to that was that if you only serve England because you think England is on the side of God and suddenly you find out that it's not, then, you can't be trusted. And that's not why he's doing it. He had no illusions about Britain's moral goodness. His idea of doing it, I serve England because I'm an Englishman. It's a country that may despise me in some respects. It's a country whose society I may not care for, but I am an Englishman, and in this situation, I will serve it, and I will even sacrifice my reputation to do so. And he did. And that's one of those things that, I think I hoped in the book to sort of give him some degree of credit for. There's a lot of other, unpleasant things. The man of tremendous faults. But still a person that still mustered his own sort of form of honor in a way. And it's one of those things he could never quite get back. And I thought maybe that, if you asked me what my biggest takeaway from the whole project was, it was that. It was that one thing that made me see him in a very different way. But he is constantly surrounded, even after the sort of twilight of his life is the 1930s and then leading up finally to his death in 1947. But when World War II breaks out, we've been talking about World War I. What about World War II and Hitler and the Nazi menace and all of this? Crowley was, remember, he had worked for naval intelligence in the First World War. And I think his employment in intelligence work in the 20s and 30s had been kind of spotty. He made some sort of very bad mistake in Italy in the early 20s. And by a bad mistake, I mean that he apparently was compromised himself, was expelled from the country, and left incriminating documents. As one of the things that Mussolini's police later record when they went through all of this, they found what they describe openly as British intelligence documents. Now, what would a guy, supposedly he was in Sicily running a kind of occult commune, the Abbey of Thelema. Mm-hmm. It was his Sicilian period. But, he was doing something else. He was collecting information about political affairs in Italy. That's what the Italians caught on to, and that's why they kicked him, not his followers, just him out. But Crowley made various attempts to try to recover his reputation. He had some friends in the press, and in the early 30s, he actually got them to try to run some articles that he thought would, he couldn't come out and say what he'd actually done. He couldn't tell the real story, but he would try to put let's say, a kind of better gloss on the story. And he would try to refute some of the other stories about him, that he engaged in child sacrifice and open Satanism, and saying that as they generally were exaggerations. That pretty much fell on deaf ears, because by that time most people already wanted to believe him in a certain way. It's another one of those. It's a tale that once you establish a reputation, you can be stuck with it. And Crowley, for many years, kind of went out of his way and relished being thought of as, the fact that decent British people were afraid of him or were horrified by him. He liked horrifying people. But then in the latter part of his life, he learned that he had painted himself with colors that he couldn't wash off, and could never really restore any kind of semblance of that. But when World War II broke out, remember, Crowley by this time is, he's not terribly old, but he's in poor health. He is a hopeless heroin addict. And, that too is, he took all kinds of drugs. Mescaline was one of his favorites, ether. The odd thing is that the drug he becomes addicted to, heroin, was not one that he used recreationally. The reason he became addicted to heroin was because it was prescribed to him as a treatment for asthma. And that's one of those things. It's like one of those stories about the fact, Coca-Cola actually used to have coca in it.
Right.
And they used to be able to buy, opium at the druggist through laudanum. Well, one of the things, and apparently it works, is that from the time he was a child, he suffered from asthma. That is a serious illness and a terrifying illness for both a child and an adult. And one of the things that was prescribed was, you take this drug and it will relieve the symptoms. And it did. Of course, you also get addicted to it. But that was, that again is one of these kind of ironies, that he becomes addicted to a drug that really isn't part of his regimen of recreational drugs. But nevertheless, you got this guy who's, a kind of washed up junkie in 1939 when the war starts. But he gets, within days of the war starting, he gets a message from Admiral Godfrey. And Admiral Godfrey is now the new head of naval intelligence, asking him to stop by for a chat. So he's invited when the new war breaks out. Somebody remembers this. And the only reason they would remember it is based upon something he had done before. And he's also given a particular officer to go to. I think it's a Captain Lang, and he's given a telephone extension to call Captain Lang. Now, one of the people who I was, sort of blessed with getting acquainted with in this research was the friend of a friend of mine who lives in Britain. And he's one of those people who's very interested in things like intelligence agency phone numbers, okay? Believe it or not, there's somebody out there who researches things like in the Admiralty and MI6 as to where the phone, what the phone numbers go to and what offices they correspond to. And he was able to tell me that Lang's phone number and Lang himself belonged to that branch of naval intelligence that dealt with the interrogation of prisoners of war. Now, that's one of the things. So Crowley gets a message from Admiral Godfrey. Keep in mind, Admiral Godfrey's personal secretary then or somewhat later was a guy named Ian Fleming, which I think most have heard of.
Right.
So that's, if you ever wondered where Ian Fleming ran across Crowley, that's where. And so he's invited to come in, talk to Lang, and so what's that about? Why him? And that is one of the interesting thing there is that it spins off into the whole story about Rudolf Hess. Does that ring a bell?
It does, but I'm trying to remember how I know Rudolf Hess's name, so please enlighten me.
Rudolf Hess was, for many, many years, Adolf Hitler's right-hand man in the Nazi Party.
Right.
He and Hitler sort of grew somewhat estranged as they moved towards World War II. And the reason for that was that Rudy didn't want war with the English. He wanted to do anything he could to avoid a war with England, which he thought was a terrible fratricidal struggle between two Aryan countries. Okay, they should be united against the Bolsheviks, he thought. So Hess was upset by the fact that Britain was at war with Germany. And in early 1941, in May 1941, not long before Hitler is going to change the whole course of the war by invading Russia, he is most famous perhaps for getting in a plane on his own, as far as we can tell, flying off, crash landing in Scotland and being taken prisoner by the British and held there for the rest of the war and then imprisoned for decades after the war. But what Hess's mission was, what he wanted to do was he was flying to Britain on this kind of one-man mission to negotiate a separate peace. He was so determined to bring about a peace settlement between England and Germany that he apparently took it upon himself to do that. And there were people, he was headed for a guy named the Duke of Hamilton, which, as it turns out, was one of those figures in the British establishment who were willing to make a peace at that point. Now, the guy, of course, who didn't want that to happen and who then kept Hess as a kind of personal prisoner for the rest of the war was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill realized that within his own government, there were those people who were looking for a chance to make a deal with the Germans because they thought it was their way out of a losing situation at this point. So Hess He's held this very incommunicado prisoner, during which time he is interrogated, because this was a guy who was like Hitler's right-hand man, so the British are interrogating him right and left. And one of the things they used in interrogating him was drugs. You know, it's like MK Ultra before there was MK Ultra. You know, they just didn't think of that in 1950. The idea that you could use psychoactive substances to make people more susceptible to telling the truth or interrogation goes back years.
Right.
And you know, oddly, one of the drugs which was commonly used in that was mescaline. Remember me mentioning that Crowley's probably favorite recreational drug was mescaline.
Right.
In fact, he had performed all kinds of sort of personal experiments with it. Give you an example of one of those things. One of the things that Aleister would do, and this goes back to, you know, World War I, wartime New York. He would invite people over for dinner, and he would fix them, let's say, a tasty curry, you know, because curries are yummy, but they also have a lot of spices that cover up other tastes. And he would then dose the food with a certain amount of mescaline. And he would carefully note how much he was putting in and how much was being served and the size, you know, and approximate age of the people who were eating it. And then he would sit back and watch the effects and take notes. So he was on his own, or was it on his own? Was it under the suggestion of someone else, carrying out experiments of dosing people with psychoactive drugs to see what their effects would be? Now, one of the things, if you look into the whole story of Rudolf Hess was, you know, he was often accused of being insane. I'm not sure he was. It made a good excuse to not pay any attention to what he said. But when he was held prisoner by the British during the war, he accused them of putting Mexican brain poison in his food. And so what did he mean by Mexican brain poison? I'd never run across that term. Well, turns out that was a term somebody came up with for mescaline. So Rudolf Hess claimed that he was being dosed by his British captors with mescaline. Aleister Crowley, previous asset of British intelligence, had carried out experiments with the effects of mescaline. Same Crowley had been asked to visit a naval intelligence officer in charge of interrogations of prisoners of war at the very beginning of the war. So did Crowley have a relationship with them? And is that where this whole idea of using Mexican brain poison came from? I mean, it's one of those things where you can't fit all of the pieces together, but you see that it's very curious. The even more curious story in this, and one of those things that I recount in the book, but I note that, you know, it's really based, you know, it's one of those things that technically isn't supposed to have happened, and in which you have only one source for it happening, and that a kind of dubious one. In fact, a kind of British Nazi, that is an English Nazi, a guy who was himself interned during the war for his pro-German sympathies. But he supposedly got this story from some other German officers that were held in a place called Ham Common. Now, that's not actually the place, it's the place that surrounds it. It was also known as Camp 020 or Camp 020. Now, what it was, if that sounds kind of spooky, is that, you know, we hear today about black sites and rendition, you know,
right. Yeah.
prisons that aren't supposed to exist. Mm-hmm. Well, this was one of those places. This was a place controlled by British intelligence in which certain high-value enemy prisoners of war were taken out of regular captivity and where they were held and interrogated, and maybe more than that, in secret. You know, it's one of those places that people were taken to where it doesn't exist, and therefore you don't exist.
Right.
Well, what one, you know, survivor of this camp said is that he swore that one evening he knew that Hess was there. He knew that Hess had been taken from his original place of employment and had been taken to Ham Common, and that at the same time he saw Aleister Crowley walking down the hall. He saw them there. Now, again, he doesn't place them in the same room, but that is a relatively small place. Now, that's one of those things that could be somebody's, flight of fancy. It could be just some sort of story that they made up, or it may contain, it's an odd thing to kind of make up because it sort of fits in some way. But you don't even have to include the ham common thing to really sort of create this question as to what Crowley, now Crowley claimed he did a number of things for the government. He claimed, that he gave, I think he tried to take credit for, Churchill's V for victory sign, arguing it's actually an occult hand signal that invokes the god Typhon and Apulpus. You'll see other stories that argue that Crowley was in some way involved in creating a mass meeting of British witches to put a hex on the Nazis or keep them from crossing the Channel.
Right, the Operation Cone of Power. Isn't that the one?
So Operation Mistletoe. I think it has a number of names to it. That's one of those things that I think is pretty much, I'm not saying probably there were British witches who got together and did that. Whether you can connect Crowley to them, just in case you don't think I believe everything, I tend not to believe that. I think he gets roped into that. And in the same way that one of the things you'll come across, constantly, is that Aleister Crowley, during the rise of Hitler, was in some way, he was some sort of advisor to Hitler. He met Hitler. He taught Hitler how to do hand gestures. I think there's even somebody who makes an argument that Aleister Crowley was Hitler, okay, or they programmed him in some way. And so there are all of these things in terms of Crowley and Hitler. As far as I have been able to determine, and that doesn't mean that this rules everything out, they never met each other or got anywhere near each other. Crowley did know German occultists who were fascinated by Hitler and met him briefly. But he never seems to, and it's also interesting to note, and I think one of the kind of, an area in this whole story that could really be fleshed out is that Crowley lived in Berlin. By the way, receiving an acknowledged stipend from British intelligence for supposedly spying on IRA people there, but you can bet he was doing other things.
Right.
He was in Berlin as the Nazis are rising to power. He leaves before Hitler becomes chancellor, and he's never there again, as far as I can tell, after that. So any sort of stories that Hitler, visited, or rather that Crowley visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden in 1939, I think is, make-believe. But he was there as Hitler was rising to power. And I think I'd be willing to, and this is something that's not in the book, so your listeners will hear this for the first time. There's another very interesting character, which, if they've never heard of Aleister Crowley, I bet they've never heard of a guy by the name of Erik Jan Hannesson. But Erik Jan Hannesson, if you were in Germany, and especially in Berlin in the late 1920s, you would have heard of this guy because he was one of the hottest tickets in town. He was basically he was a psychic, a mind reader. That's what his main gig was.
And we'll be doing a show on that tomorrow, by the way.
Hannesson was a mind reader. So there's sometimes he's called Hitler's psychic. And then
right.
The other thing about Hannesson, which makes it even more interesting, is that he's Jewish. So he's Hitler's Jewish psychic. Right,
his Jewish clairvoyant, I think they billed him as well, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so one of the things about Hannesson is that Hannesson actually he was introduced to Hitler. He met him on at least 2 or 3 occasions. And he actually, the other thing that Hannesson branched into was in astrology, predicting the future. So it was Hannesson who, when Hitler was kind of, bummed out after not winning the German presidency, reassured him that, yes, you will be chancellor, you will be the ruler of Germany, don't despair, I see it in the stars, you can take my word for it. And Hannesson is also supposed to have given Hannesson was a great stage performer, and so there's a good suggestion that he gave Hitler tips. Hitler was already an accomplished speaker, but he gave Hitler sort of tips on mass psychology. That one of the things you want to do when speaking to a crowd is you want to hypnotize them.
Right.
And that was something, by the way, Crowley was also an expert in hypnosis as well. So the thing is that Hannesson and Crowley, Hannesson was like this big celebrity in late Weimar Germany when Crowley's there. And I know there can be no question that Crowley would have been curious about him. He must have attended his shows. Crowley, in fact, he had this kind of almost morbid curiosity about stage magicians and performers. So he would have been there. He would have been aware of him. And yet in his diaries from that period, as far as one can tell, he never mentions him. And that's one of those things, as strange as it may sound, to me, it means Hanneson's name is conspicuous by its absence. There should be some sort of just offhand reference to this person who was there, and it was publishing, sort of two popular daily, one a magazine about astrology and another one about affairs, and was actually boosting the Nazis in his paper by basically arguing this was what the stars were predicting, that Hitler was the man of the future. And so Hanneson was riding high in this period. So Hanneson, keep in mind, is an occultist. He also, engaged in ritual magic, at least, for show. Hanneson was this kind of occultist celebrity who really did have a connection to Hitler, and who did meet him, and who did advise him, and who did support his cause. And I think what has happened over the years is that Crowley has been sort of moved into this role that Hanneson actually occupied. Hanneson has almost disappeared as an historical figure. It's very, it's relatively difficult to find things about him, partly because he's just so, the fact that he was a Jew openly supporting the Nazis, how are we supposed to spin that? It's just easier not to bring it up. But whereas Crowley, it's easier to believe. So I think in that case, most of the stories, if not all of them, about the connection between Aleister Crowley and Hitler is a case of sort of mistaken identity with Hanneson. And it's the type of thing that in history you can see, as one person sort of rises and, awareness about them increase. Hanneson is forgotten, but Crowley becomes more and more this kind of mythical figure. So it's fairly easy to connect him with that. But that's, I think, basically it's a case of mistaken identity. But it still leaves the question, what kind of connection was there between Crowley and Hanneson? Did they meet each other in Berlin? If they did, what did they have to say with each other? Is Hanneson the guy? Now, imagine Hanneson is someone who is essentially a stage performer. Maybe he has psychic powers, maybe he doesn't, but he's very close friends with prominent Germans and the Nazis. He's like, their chief soothsayer for a while. He predicts that Hitler will become chancellor, and Hitler becomes chancellor. Now, I guess the question here is that what could possibly go wrong? Was it the fact that his Nazi friends found out he was a Jew? Nah, they knew that all along. Okay, they would always find that wasn't the issue. So if you ever read this thing that he was killed because they suddenly woke up and discovered, oh no, he's a Jew. No, that's not it. They knew that. Everybody knew it. The Berlin communist press, who hated Hanneson as a pro-Nazi, published everything about his marriage and his background. All of that was public knowledge. No, what got him into trouble was that he predicted one evening at his very stylish apartment, which he liked to dub the Palace of the Occult, where the rich and famous gathered to have their fortunes told and to have him dispense wisdom. He said he saw the burning of a great German building, and that this was going to have, and this was right before the Reichstag burned down. The Reichstag, which the Nazis basically organized the burning of in order to create a emergency to give their new chancellor dictatorial powers. And what got Hanneson into trouble was that by predicting that, it was kind of a tip. He was close to the Nazis, and so his enemies would say, well, there's only two explanations for this. One, Hanneson actually has psychic powers, which we don't believe. And if he doesn't have psychic powers, then he heard this from his Nazi buddies, who, as we suspected, burned the place down. That made him difficult to have around, so his bullet-riddled, decomposing body was found in the woods outside Berlin a couple of weeks later. So that's why he was disposed of. And that and other reasons is why he's kind of disappeared from history, whereas Crowley's reputation has risen.
Fascinating stuff. And obviously, you've written quite a few different books that are going to appeal to our audience. I know we've got to say goodbye at this point, but if people are interested, can you give us some of the other titles so they can make sure to look for it? And I'm going to put a link up to the page so you can find his books and information. But what are some of the other ones you think our audience might be interested in?
Well, I mentioned early on that I wrote a book called Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. If anybody's ever heard of Sidney Riley, or if anybody looks into a guy who's supposed to be the model for James Bond, that's a guy he wasn't, but that's another part of his myth. That, again, is much about very sort of the secret world of the early 20th century and events surrounding the Russian Revolution. I also co-authored with Walter Bosley a book called Empire of the Wheel, which is about occult and murder in 1950 in California, which is about a spate of very strange sort of ritualistic murders that don't seem to have any connection in San Bernardino, peaceful little San Bernardino, nestled out there on the edges of the orange groves in that period. But we explore a number of quite interesting and creepy connections to that. And then my most recent work, the one I certainly want to bring out, is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. So if any of your listeners have ever heard of a book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, that was written in the 1970s by Anthony Sutton, the man who I've dedicated this new book to, my book is really a much expanded look at that. And what it again examines is that, well, let me leave you with this. The Russian Revolution in 1917, like any revolution, doesn't happen by accident. And revolutions need money. Revolutionaries never have a lot of money, but bankers and businessmen do. And that book explores a long train of connections between people in the American establishment and on Wall Street in terms of supporting radical movements in Tsarist Russia, and then in a whole array of fascinating business dealings with the Bolsheviks after they come to power. Read it, and you'll certainly be enlightened by something.
Richard, I will post that up and make sure everybody can find it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
Tomorrow, Mel Gordon joins us as we talk about Hitler's Jewish clairvoyant, more of the strange and supernatural here on the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This is Beyond the Darkness.